Watchmen is a 12-issue comic book series released in the 1980s, written by Alan Moore and drawn by Dave Gibbons. It is potentially the best and most revolutionary superhero story ever written, and it's something that is incredibly well known and has been talked about and analyzed in every possible way imaginable. It's kind of hard to find anybody who isn't even slightly a nerd that doesn't have some kind of understanding or history with this specific comic book. It's one of those standout pieces of art that kind of transcends its own medium. Even people that hardly ever or don't even read comics will give Watchmen a go and usually come out the other end with a respect for it, at least in some way. I've even heard people say that they talked about it in their college writing classes. So since it's so well known and it's been analyzed to death, what could I possibly say or add to the conversation that hasn't already been said? Well, probably nothing. But nonetheless, I have felt like revisiting Watchmen for some time now, having not read it in nearly a decade, so as I go through it again, I'm just going to share my thoughts on all the chapters and give you my opinions on the story and its characters to kind of give you guys a massive full comic series review, because like many others, and no shock to anybody, I deeply appreciate and respect this work of art for many reasons. When it comes to Western comics, I tend to phase in and out of them, and when it comes to superheroes, I generally gravitate towards, well, like Batman. But Alan Moore has always been one of my favorite comic book writers due to his creativity and his ability to deconstruct characters without feeling like he's insulting them along the way. His Swamp Thing series is seriously one of my favorite things ever, and I'll definitely have to talk about it at some point. It's just so good. But when it comes to Watchmen, he did something that, without its existence, the entire landscape of comic book heroes and even movies and TV shows might be incredibly different than they are today. It might seem super common now with shows like The Boys or Invincible that we are able to have these adult storylines within the superhero genre and display a darker side of what it would mean if people with these incredible abilities actually existed. Would it actually be good for society? Or would they, just like any human being, be capable and susceptible to being corrupted and influenced, or even be able to keep their sanity while dealing with the subjects they embody on a night after night basis? One thing I love is the simplicity of the Watchmen logo. The smiley face with just a drop of blood on it. That is everything you need to know about the intentions of this book. Before Watchmen, most superhero stories were uplifting fantasy tales geared towards a younger audience. Even if the hero struggles, they manage to save the day, and the only people that get hurt were the bad guys, and there were really no long-lasting repercussions for their actions. Alan Moore wanted to take these superheroes and write a story with them as if it took place in the real world. How would the government respond to them? How would society at large respond to them? And how would the heroes themselves act if given the authority to do whatever they wanted, or felt like they could get away with whatever they wanted? Or dealing with criminals night after night, what would that do to a person? And especially if the violence in superhero stories was real, what kind of person would you have to be if you, night after night, actually went into alleyways and beat the shit out of criminals? Originally, Alan Moore wanted to actually use established DC characters, at least that's how I understand it, correct me if I'm wrong. He wanted to use what was the recognizable status quo. Eventually, he was told that he could not do that, so each Watchmen character was designed to mimic an archetype that you would understand. You know, like the comedian is kind of like Peacemaker, Dr. Manhattan is like Captain Atom, Rorschach is like the Question, but there's lots of mixes of other superheroes like Batman, Superman, and all that kind of stuff in there too. Ultimately, I think it turned out way better with original characters since it helps Watchmen feel very distinguished as its own thing. The story itself does take place in the 1980s, but also in an alternate history because it's saying that because of these superheroes existing, they were used in the Vietnam War and stopped things like Watergate from being exposed to the public, basically saying that yes, the government uses superheroes for the greater good, meaning hiding their own darker acts in the guise of propping up America as heroic. The funny thing is, all the superheroes in Watchmen are just really people. They're just people in costumes with weapons. Many basically psychopaths with delusions of grandeur. Again, think what kind of person you would have to be if you put on a mask and went out and beat the crap out of people and were able to do that on a consistent basis. Kind of ridiculous in a real-world context, and that's how Watchmen plays it. And yet, we are also in the perspective of the heroes, and thus get all their justification for it along the way, which makes the writing really fascinating. The only hero in the story with actual superpowers is Dr. Manhattan, and I'll talk about him a bit later as I kind of want to go in order. So we'll start with the very first chapter, titled At Midnight, All the Agents. It begins with the blood-stained smiley face button on the dirty city streets as Rorschach's dialogue from his journal entry talks about the corruption of the current world. Those superheroes have now been outlawed, and this is mostly so people in power can utilize them whenever they want to for secret missions without having to deal with constant vigilantism, but some characters, like Rorschach, refuse to quit the cause, and he still continues to do his thing. The first issue is pretty much all through Rorschach's perspective. He has a very film noir look and aesthetic to him with the trench coat and the hat and always narrating his missions and writing in his journal. On the surface level, he's pretty badass. He's got a grappling hook, he's talking all mysterious, he's saying F you to the law, investigating a murder of a fallen hero, and warning the others that there might be an assassin coming after them. All while walking on rooftops, using gadgets, and breaking into various facilities. This is all stuff that would be very common in a superhero comic. And in the first issue, only slightly do we get to see the darker side, but it's still there. Such as when Rorschach enters a bar questioning information about the murder and just breaks a guy's fingers. Rorschach has intense, violent tendencies that he channels through his pursuit of justice, and this is only the very beginning of that, seeing his black and white view of the world. The other characters are introduced as he visits them. Daniel, the night owl, who has complied with the law and given up being a hero. Adrian Veidt, who is also known as Ozymandias, who is known to the public as the smartest man alive and has made profit off his superhero days, selling merchandise, toys, and building up a massive enterprise, having a lot of influence over the world in the process. And finally, Laurie, the Silk Spectre, and Dr. Manhattan, who in the first issue is really only introduced as a giant naked blue guy, who seems to be operating on a level beyond regular human understanding, not giving much thought to the comedian's death, and Silk Spectre not really caring much, mentioning that the comedian attempted to sexually assault her mother one time, which we'll get into more of that as it comes up. But right off the bat, you can see the ideas at play in issue 1 with the structure being similar to a traditional superhero comic. It's just a murder mystery, but we also see the beginnings of the corruption nearly at every angle of what a superhero is right there in our faces. Issue 2 of Watchmen, Absent Friends, is when it gets really dark and lets you know what you're in for. It might seem tame though by today's standards and having things like The Boys out there, but just the same as when I try to review older movies or older horror movies, I think it's important to remember the context of when these things came out and why it would have been so controversial at that specific time. Watchmen released in 1986, and in this issue we see flashbacks of the comedian in his prime, at one point attempting to rape the original Silk Spectre, at another point shooting a woman in Vietnam that he got pregnant in cold blood. That is some dark, wild stuff to see in a superhero comic book. I also really like the structure of this issue because it all takes place at the comedian's funeral, with each main character reflecting on a past experience with him. The only one not attending the funeral is Laurie, who instead goes to visit her mom, the original Silk Spectre, and we get a really interesting look at where the heroes that are past their prime ended up, as she dismisses the comedian's assault as life goes on, and how she misses being sexually appealing to those at the time, showing her daughter sexualizing comics that people drew of her that are disgusting to Laurie, but something that the aging Silk Spectre misses when it comes to getting all of the attention. And to me, it's kind of like she blocks out all of the negative and darker aspects of the past in order to romanticize the world of superheroes that she was a part of, taking the abuse and the sexualization and all of that as just part of being in the spotlight, a spotlight that she is no longer a part of. Adrian's flashback is an interesting one since it basically is one of the only times that we see all the heroes together and in their prime, and how the comedian's influence would linger within Adrian. He talks about it not mattering what cases they solve or over what people they save because humanity will always just continue to destroy one another with more and more advanced weaponry. The Dr. Manhattan flashback is also disturbing, as it's the one in Vietnam featuring him watching the comedian kill a woman that he got pregnant just as they're being celebrated as heroes for helping to win the war. Yet we see Manhattan's detachment from humanity, having the ability to save her easily, and instead just watching it happen. And finally, Night Owl remembering when he and the comedian were sent to control a riot against costume vigilantes, and him just enjoying mowing them down, knowing how much they hate him and the others. Perhaps the most telling, though, is when Rorschach interrogates an old enemy that the comedian appeared to just before his death, named Moloch, and apparently cried his eyes out in front of something that he discovered. All these years of trauma and the government's secrets and his actions, viewing it all as a big joke, but now those jokes have stacked up too far, and there's just no humor to be found. Issue 3 is called The Judge of All Earth, and it starts to begin to explore Dr. Manhattan a little bit more. Kind of this interesting combination between his detachment to humanity and his importance to it. Obviously, Manhattan refers to the Manhattan Project, the creation of nuclear weapons. Having only one character with superpowers in the story, and having him be so incredibly powered like a god on Earth basically makes him viewed like one of those nuclear weapons. And since he's working with America, it's like the stalemate of larger powers in the world not attacking one another for fear of use of these weapons, which makes his departure at the end of this issue kind of like a catalyst for the oncoming war. The next issue delves more into Manhattan's backstory, but this one is attempting to show us that he still interacts as a human, but is losing his capability to do so. Like how he's not truly focused and intimate with Lori, and yet also, despite being nearly omnipotent, he lashes out in anger when confronted on a TV show about how it's likely that he's been giving those close to him in his life cancer from the radiation he's emitting. Manhattan gets fed up with the media situation and teleports himself to Mars in order to be alone, which causes the rest of the world to start falling into a frenzy. Now, when I do reviews, I tend to handle them more from like a character perspective, but for Watchmen, it is also important to note that a lot of the story has political themes of the state of where the US was in the 1980s, particularly with its relation with Russia, and how this version of reality, there's an impending doomsday clock that inches closer and closer to World War III. Dan and Lori also get closer in this chapter, and it's done in a very clever way. At first, I don't even know if Lori really likes Dan like that. He's just the only other person that she knows on a deeper level from the superhero days, so he's the only one that's gonna understand her as she leaves Dr. Manhattan. Also, there's a scene where they go into an alleyway and take down a bunch of criminals attempting to rob them. Again, the violence is shown very realistically, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think this whole scene is kind of like a metaphor for sex or a sexual release, because afterwards, when they calm down and have this awkward separation, it's kind of like two friends that banged in the heat of the moment, but afterwards they're kind of unsure what the right thing to do is, so they just go their separate ways. I don't know. Good stuff. Issue 4 is called The Watchmaker, and this is a big one, and we can dive into Dr. Manhattan a lot more. Though I do like how we wait 4 issues before really talking about him and his powers explicitly, and for the first few chapters, you just kind of have to deal with this incredibly powerful naked blue guy walking around and teleporting and making copies of himself, and every other character just acting like it's totally normal. But I think it works to help build up the tension of just what is this guy and why is he here, and also shows you the over-reliance on him. So here we get his backstory. The end of the chapter, though, ends with a quote from Einstein reflecting on the creation of atomic weapons and how it's changed the world around him, stating, "I should have become a watchmaker." So getting into Dr. Manhattan's backstory, we see he was originally a human named John, the son of a watchmaker, whose father pushed him to pursue science instead of following in his footsteps as a direct result of being afraid of technology's advancement and feeling something like a watchmaker is now obsolete in a world where we can prove that time is relative. And the way this chapter is written is done as a cool reflection of that, as Dr. Manhattan is not just reflecting on his life in the past, but that part of his power is that he is kind of living all of these moments simultaneously. He no longer experiences time the same way that we do. He's ascended beyond that perception. Past, present, and future all intertwine, and it becomes this frustrating thing to endure for anyone within his life. As he reflects, we see him getting into science, building a good life, and meeting a girl that he falls in love with. Ironically, she has a watch that breaks, and he attempts to fix it. When he goes to get the fixed watch for her, he accidentally is trapped in some kind of radioactive experiment, and nobody can get him out before the machine activates, and he's evaporated. But like the mind of a watchmaker who puts things back together, slowly, somehow, he is able to reconstruct his body from the energy and emerges as a naked blue man. In many ways, I think it was a great decision to only have one superpowered character because it puts all eyes on him and floods the world with anxiety, similarly to the atomic bomb itself. There's a panel where he says that the country leaders needed him to fight crime, so that's what he did, with complete indifference. It's not so that he can be a hero, it's so America can show the rest of the world that we have the power, that the Superman is American. And they are the ones who gave him the Dr. Manhattan name to serve as a recognizable fear of that term. Now, this experiment obviously changed him as a person. It never directly states it, but the more that he attempts to interact with humans, the less that he feels like one. Primarily with his girlfriend, who gets frustrated that he can basically see their whole future and knows what she's going to say before she says it. Also, when he meets Lori for the first time and begins to give her more attention than his girlfriend, who is aging, being drawn towards the younger, more beautiful girl as he will never age. But speaking of, it's also mentioned that Lori is around 16 at the point that they meet, so not good. Not to mention all of the atrocities that he doesn't stop, like the JFK assassination or other murders like shown with the comedian. So again, interesting as this whole chapter is from Manhattan's perspective, but viewed outside of that perspective, it's hard not to look at him negatively and see him using this ascended form to kind of escape responsibility. But he's so blank and matter-of-fact as he speaks, with constantly going back and forth through time, that I think a truth both with his character and his frustrations is that humanity is complicated, and he no longer wants anything to do with it. And that part, I understand. Chapter 5, Fearful Symmetry. Compared to the previous few chapters, this one can seem a little bit all over the place, but it's all laying the groundwork for the bigger story moments. But besides that, this issue has a lot of pages dedicated to a story within a story that goes through the whole comic. As people on the streets talk and gossip about a potential oncoming world war, a kid reads a comic book called The Black Freighter. And the Black Freighter stuff is hit or miss with some people. Some people skip it entirely. Some people think it is extremely profound. It's a story about a guy that gets shipwrecked and has to do some admittedly horrible things in order to survive, like crafting a raft from dead corpses, all in order to escape an oncoming disaster, and he kind of sort of loses his mind in the process. So in some ways, you can mirror this story to what happens with Ozymandias and the story of Watchmen in general, or how people with the right incentive can justify any action they take, especially if they believe it'll result in the greater good. Because here in this chapter, we have the beginning teases of that. Ozymandias is attacked by an assassin that he quickly takes out, but early spoiler, as if you weren't expecting spoilers in this video, he says that the assassin has a poison capsule in his mouth that Ozymandias is clearly putting there himself. In other words, it was all an attempt to draw suspicion off of him. But it works, as seeing the accumulation of the comedian's murder, Ozymandias' attempted murder, and Dr. Manhattan having to leave Earth, solving this mystery is driving Rorschach to some incredibly dark places, as if he weren't already there. He's been continuously torturing Moloch, who is just a retired villain at this point, and all of his journal entries and inner monologue get more and more reminiscent of something that a character like Travis Bickle from Taxi Driver would say. Someone that looks around and is disgusted by his surroundings, given reasons why everyone else is the problem, thinking that somebody needs to fix this, and so on and so forth. And I'm not saying Rorschach doesn't do any good, but him being so happy to run into a criminal in the alleyway, ready to strangle him, lies within understanding what kind of man he is. Heroism is his outlet for violence, to release this energy from his stressful past, but so long as he can get himself to believe that it's for the greater good, he can justify it more and more. Maybe similar to a Batman archetype, where Batman is the true personality and Bruce Wayne is the mask. When Rorschach is caught by the police at the end of the chapter, they take off his mask and he screams for them to give him back his real face. There's also a few scenes of Dan and Laurie getting awkwardly closer without wanting to admit their true feelings in this chapter. Also, I don't think that I mentioned it, but since giving up being Night Owl, Dan has been depicted as being a bit overweight and incredibly out of his element. He's basically a man past his prime that just didn't keep up with himself. Chapter 6, The Abyss Gazes Also. Similar to the Dr. Manhattan backstory chapter, this one focuses heavily on what makes Rorschach Rorschach. A Rorschach test is a psychological test where patients look at an ink blot and interpret it into an image, usually revealing something in their subconscious. In this chapter, Rorschach has been captured and taken to prison alongside given a therapist that attempts to analyze and understand him. And continuing with the unique way to tell a story, this chapter is mostly done through the therapist's inner dialogue, talking about Rorschach and maybe even being influenced by him, seeing what an unwavering powerful force Rorschach is, and how that can intrigue and affect somebody else around him. Rorschach may be psychologically damaged, but he is a smart guy. He knows that the therapist is only there giving him time because of his reputation, as well as even being surrounded by criminals who all hate him. He is uncompromising and still attacking them even in prison. We learn Rorschach's real name is Walter Kovacs, and within his origins, we see the darkness that he endured. Low-income, single-mother household where his mom directly admits that she wished that she had an abortion. She's whoring herself out in order to make ends meet. He's being abused and bullied by other kids, and it's not long before he lashes out at them, blinding another kid when he was only 10 years old. I love the panel of him just biting this other kid's face, showing that primal animalistic rage that's inside of him. When Rorschach finally decides to open up a bit to the therapist, he talks about how at first he was just Walter pretending to be Rorschach, somebody wanting to be a vigilante, wanting to work alongside other heroes. But what made him Rorschach and cemented this identity was an incident involving a missing girl that he discovered was fed to dogs by a sick murderer. He hacks up the dogs and then leaves the murderer tied up to burn after setting the house on fire. I think one of the best things good writers can do is that in spite of everything a character does, make us be able to understand them. Given Rorschach's history, his childhood, and coming face to face with that child killer, is it any wonder he became so extreme? And it's one of those great moments where you wonder that if you were in his position in that moment, what would you do? Put your faith in the law, or just let the guy burn? Chapter 7, A Brother to Dragons. This is a very dialogue-heavy chapter that primarily focuses on developing the relationship between Dan and Laurie further. Laurie seems to be intrigued and curious about all the technology and gadgets Dan has in his owl cave, I guess we'll call it, but he's constantly downplaying and trying to avoid direct conversation about it, almost paralleling the same way that he's approaching their relationship. Dan at this point is out of shape, past his prime, deeply insecure, but doesn't exactly want to admit any of this. One telling scene is when he and Laurie are on the couch watching TV. There's a moment where Ozymandias shows up on the screen, still showcasing his acrobatic skill and physical prowess while being in his 40s, having kept up with all of his training. While at the same time, Dan and Laurie are just trying to get it on, and it's all awkward and stumbling and moving, and ultimately, Dan can't even get a boner. Super embarrassing moment, but hey, Laurie is totally cool about it, as all good women should be. But all of this leads to a dream sequence that is perhaps a little too on the nose, but effective, of them peeling off each other's skin, showing their costumes underneath. Dan is compelled to go back into the cave and finally face what he's been denying, putting on the Night Owl costume and becoming his true self. He and Laurie both suit up and take out his flying owl ship thing. I don't really know what it is, but it's a flying owl ship thing. They go outside and actually end up doing some real superhero shit, like saving some people from a burning building. And it's only after they do this, after they suit up, that Dan can get it up It makes them feel alive. It makes them able to say and do the things that their alter egos couldn't. It makes them more invested in what else they could do now. So, first things first, break Rorschach out of jail. Chapter 8 is called Old Ghost. This might sound weird, but the opening of this chapter kind of reminds me of something you would see on Better Call Saul, where it shows you just an item that at first seems inconsequential, but by the end of the episode has an extreme significance, such as the small statue of the original Night Owl as he reflects back on the glory days of the Minutemen heroes, and then the chapter ultimately ends with that very statue being picked up and used as a weapon to kill this elderly man. And that kind of symbolism of that classic hero pose and how it's supposed to represent something so wholesome and inspiring, but that was many years ago, and here in modern day, it's been tainted and manipulated to despair. This chapter really sets up a lot of things into motion. Most of the first half of Watchmen is important character building stuff, but now the momentum is heightening, especially with Dan and Laurie becoming vigilantes once more, and the law is immediately onto them, putting a bigger sense of urgency on their plans. The Rorschach breakout scene works pretty well. There's a little subplot going on within the prison itself, waiting to take him out, but at the same time, it is a little bit convenient that Night Owl and Silk Spectre show up to break him out just as this is happening, but it's entertaining enough that you go with it. And of course, Rorschach can't leave the prison without finishing up the job and murdering that criminal. But with that, we have this slow assembly of the Watchmen coming back together. But no sooner does this happen, Dr. Manhattan returns in order to take Spectre to Mars to have a conversation that he's foreseen. Also, as may be common after a recent breakup, Spectre does continuously bring up Dr. Manhattan time and time again in this chapter before his eventual return. Dan keeps giving her the benefit of the doubt, but maybe on some level, she kind of sensed that she would be seeing him again soon. You don't dive back into all this superhero stuff without the real guy with powers showing up inevitably. But not only does Laurie get taken away, the police raid Dan's home, so he and Rorschach are forced to flee, and as it's alluded to, with the awareness of the costume vigilante's return, a gang decides to go to who they know was a hero and take him out. But of course, now he's too old to fight back, and remembering the glory days or how violence and fighting looked in classic comics is juxtaposed with how violence looks in reality and what's facing him now. Chapter 9, The Darkness of Mere Being. A lot of stories deal with this idea of, is humanity worth saving? Do we actually do more harm than good? And would the world be better off without humans in it? And this chapter does a pretty good job exploring this topic while being both large scale and small scale at the same time. The large scale is that it all takes place on Mars, and a lot of the shots show these huge canyons and landscapes, the structure that Manhattan is built, and of course the endless outer space backdrop. It's a visual spectacle of a chapter. And the smaller scale is that as we are talking about all of humanity at once, it focuses deeply on Laurie and only Laurie and a lot of her history. Dr. Manhattan has foreseen if he returns to Earth, there will be an incredible level of devastation. And he's thinking that, as he does with most things, maybe he will just let it happen. He no longer sees the value in human life and uses Mars as an example that it's beautiful and intricate and just fine existing without organic life. And as he and Laurie have this back and forth conversation about a potential value of human life, we see instances of her past, with her mother pushing her into this way of life, but also being incredibly overprotective, hiding some great secrets, in which Laurie assumes is that her real dad was one of the fellow Minutemen heroes. Well, she's right, but the big reveal leads us to several moments later when the comedian talks to her and Laurie's mom pulls her away, admitting to Laurie that he sexually assaulted her. In a future interaction, Laurie calls him out on this, and the comedian says it was only the one time. A super creepy line in general, but also implying that they had an ongoing sexual relationship, and it's one of those really uncomfortable breaking the fourth wall moments of how you see your parents, and yes, confirms that the comedian was her biological father. Really powerful images in the comic that as she realizes this and her entire world shatters, so does the structure that Dr. Manhattan had built. The takeaway from Dr. Manhattan, though, is that the reason Laurie is even here with him, he does care about her, he does value her, And it's a moment where he recognizes the extreme complications that even resulted in her existence and how unlikely it was. A miracle that deserves preserving, and realizing that, he also attributes that itself to countless other people. He says the world is so crowded with these miracles that they become commonplace, and I forget them. We gaze continuously until it grows dull. And that's how it usually ends up. As an individual, we are unique and interesting, but viewed as a collective, we become just statistics. The way world leaders see us, maybe. It's easy to forget just how important one person can be. Chapter 10, Two Riders Were Approaching. Overall, I don't have much to say about this one, which is ironic since this one is filled to the brim with exposition dialogue, but that's what it is. Night Owl and Rorschach go back to Rorschach's apartment to get him another costume. There's a neat moment where they run into the landlady who said on the news that Rorschach sexually advanced on her, which he did not, but Rorschach leaves them be because he sees her poor children, and it's kind of a reflection of the way that he grew up. And then it immediately cuts to Ozymandias living in luxury in sort of a knockoff Fortress of Solitude, watching and waiting for something on dozens of TV screens. There is an interesting commentary here, too, that he mentions that during war times or approaching war, that media tends to get hypersexualized, and it's hard not to see that reflected in modern times with current-day social media amidst all the chaos happening in the modern world. It was just funny that this was written back in the 80s, but that still kind of applies today. But really, the rest of the issue is Night Owl and Rorschach hunting down clues, wanting to warn Ozymandias to get him on board, only to discover that he may have had involvement in the assassinations, and eventually it leads them going to his hidden location in Antarctica, basically prepping us for the final act of the story. Oh, and Rorschach predicting that this may be his ultimate fate. He leaves his journal to be found by one of the conspiracy newspaper offices. Chapter 11, Look on My Works, Ye Mighty. And so, yeah, this is the one. The reveal of Ozymandias' master plan and the execution of it through this chapter is pretty incredible. We get a little bit of backstory on him and his academic achievements, along with his early days of becoming a superhero and meeting the comedian. But I love how all of this is done while he gives a few of his servants kind of drinks that are actually filled with poison, letting them slowly die as he's telling his story. So basically, he really is only talking to himself here and just wants to hear himself talk. It's like he waited all this time to give himself a praising speech, but the only audience is himself. There's a brief confrontation when Night Owl and Rorschach show up, and Ozymandias just beats them down easily, and then continues back into his monologue while simultaneously showing us the recurring side characters in the city, all building up to whatever the hell that he's doing. And that is to save the world. It's kind of an advanced version of the trolley problem. Would you be willing to kill one person to save 5 people? The few versus the many. It basically boils down to him seeing this oncoming World War III and feeling as though the only way to stop humanity from destroying one another is to give them a mutual threat. And that threat can't come from the world of man. So it has to be, well, alien. Adrian spent years of his life after meeting Dr. Manhattan trying to develop his own means of teleportation, and has constructed this fake giant alien creature that would be sent to New York through teleportation, detonating a shockwave when it arrives and killing half the city. This is what the comedian discovered, and it broke him, and it's also why Adrian killed him. All in an attempt to give humanity a reason to band together against a bigger threat. In order to do that, he has to sacrifice millions of lives, but this sacrifice could, and of course that's only in theory, save humanity from world war. In this extremely morally ambiguous comic, we get this extremely morally ambiguous plan. But the best moment of the chapter is not the reveal of the plan, but the subversion of the typical superhero comic exposition, where the villain would tell the hero his plan and then he stopped. Adrian admits the only reason that he is telling Night Owl and Rorschach his plan is because the plan is already done. This entire time and this entire issue has happened after the attack. Adrian did exactly as he had planned, and with the symbolism of his hero name, Ozymandias, based on a very iconic poem about Ramses II and the realism that his reign and kingdom had eventually fallen to dust and his statue broken, despite his declaration to look upon his works and despair. Yet nothing of it remains. Chapter 12, the final chapter of Watchmen, A Stronger, Loving World, which really makes the reader try to decide which side of the fence that they fall on. The damage has been done, and Ozymandias has won. The first couple pages dedicate only to seeing the result of his destruction and the alien creature that he had constructed, that if looking closely was alluded to a few times in earlier chapters. Able to do this with Dr. Manhattan off-world, in which he also orchestrated. But as Dr. Manhattan and Laurie return to Earth, I do find it funny how quickly Manhattan is able to realize and analyze the situation and trace it back to Adrian. There's a brief confrontation when Dr. Manhattan shows up in Antarctica. Adrian lures him into a spot where he switches on a device to dematerialize him, even sacrificing his big pet cat in the process. What a dick. But I love when Dr. Manhattan immediately returns and says that putting himself back together was the first thing he ever did, so it was very easy for him. Also telling Adrian that if he is the world's smartest man, it means no more to Dr. Manhattan than if he was the world's smartest termite. I don't know. That's just a cold as fuck line. I love it. The ultimate true crux of this chapter, though, is through watching the various news sources, it's true. World War III has been put on hold as humanity attempts to understand the otherworldly attack. So now, what do the Watchmen do? Do they expose the true plot that sends the world back into fighting one another, or do they all vow to keep it a secret? It's something they wrestle with, but even as they reluctantly agree that secrecy is the best method, Rorschach refuses. The entire identity that Rorschach has created for himself relies on attacking any injustice that he sees. He sees the world in black and white. As he states, even in the face of Armageddon, he's unwavering. And I think that it's because of this moment is a large reason why Rorschach is many people's favorite character. Accepting this lie will break who he is. But he also knows that Dr. Manhattan will not let him leave the island in order to tell it. As he unmasks himself, taking off his true face, tears running down his cheeks, he just tells him to do it. Kind of, I guess, to say that if this is the new world, then a Rorschach cannot exist. And Dr. Manhattan evaporates him. I think it's one of the most shocking moments in the whole story, and it's really sad because at the end of the day, these characters are not comic book superheroes like you would traditionally imagine. Rorschach was a deeply psychologically broken, mentally ill person, and I almost see his childhood self in the final panels of his face crying. Maybe like many of us when we grow up and just can't face how cruel and unfair the world actually is. At last, the characters go their separate ways. Dr. Manhattan finds some contentment in the idea of Laurie being happy with Dan and decides to leave Earth for good, even stating that he may attempt to create life of his own, which is interesting. Adrian is forced to now live with his decision of what he did, and also the ominous message from Manhattan saying that nothing truly ever ends. It's widely open to interpretation, but I'm guessing it has something to do with both war and peace, maybe saying that problems can only temporarily be solved and eventually everything returns. Dan and Laurie are forced to take on new identities, but do end up together, so there's at least a shred of happiness there. And the final panel focuses on the conspiracy newspaper that Rorschach left his journal at. If it gets published, people will have an opportunity to see his perspective. And sure, all the information learned in Antarctica will not be in the journal, but maybe after years of conspiracy theorists analyzing it and reflecting on the clues that they have from it, maybe somebody will put it all together. Who will believe them? Well, that's up for the future to decide. The ending is kind of purposely ambiguous so that you can make the decision of what you think happens next. But it also may not be far from commentary on real-world events and how uncomfortable truths get swept under the rug in favor of keeping us distracted. History is written by the winners, as they say. And so, Watchmen as a story does many, many things. It's a commentary on humanity's collective view of the world, our fear of oncoming war and devastation, and our distractions from it. which is even more ironic because of the superhero subject matter, which comic books and superhero stories themselves give us that escapism and help us believe in truth and justice and doing the right thing and believing that we can overcome evil. But in the real world, thinking about good and evil in terms of black and white oftentimes doesn't work, which is why Rorschach's idealism cannot work within this world. It's why Dr. Manhattan, an actual superpowered character, cannot live with or connect with or understand this world. Dan and Lori look back on a better time, wanting to feel that alive again, but that time is gone now. And Adrian, despite his questionable morals, has the power, status, and influence to basically do whatever he wants, and he doesn't have to be an upstanding citizen in order to do them. And the comedian, well, maybe he had some merit when he said that this is all just a sick joke. Anyways, guys, that is just kind of a brief recap and overview of Watchmen. I haven't read it in a really long time, and I wanted to re-experience it, but you could easily make an 8-hour video going in detail on every single panel of this comic. It's really, really dense. Plus, I don't know if I am the perfect person to give you the most accurate 100% interpretation, but this video just serves as my review and my thoughts and ideas about some of the characters and story points. And I feel that every time I do reread it, which I think this is the third time in total, you do get more out of it. And of course, I'm much older now than I was the last time I read it, so I think that that helps as well. So if you guys are fans of Watchmen, let me know what you think about it down below. What do you think about it? The story, the themes, the characters, who's your favorite character? And would you reveal the truth at the end of the story? Or would you also keep it a secret? Let me know that in the comments below. Also, guys, please like the video and comment to help it out in the algorithm. And if you want to support the channel on a deeper level, I do have a Patreon, channel memberships, merch store, and all the various social media links where you can follow me down below. Other than that, guys, I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and I'll talk to you next time.